Hello and welcome to this podcast series, Free Irish Women in Indian Nationalism, brought to you by the University of Strathclyde. My name is Lucille and this is episode 6, Maternal Imperialists or Feminist Allies. As you've already heard in the last episode, Sister Nivedita and Annie Besant had very different relationships with Indian feminism, so it'll be interesting to see what role Margaret Cousins had in Indian feminism, and how this was understood by the Irish press. Was she a maternal imperialist, a feminist ally, or somewhere in between? Unlike Annie Besant, Margaret Cousins devoted much of her career to bringing Indian women into politics. Although Cousins had been in India since 1915, she arrived on the feminist scene in 1917 when she founded the Women's Indian Association alongside Annie Besant, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, Dhanvanthi Ramarao, Muthu Lakshmi Reddy, and Hirabai Tata, as well as its sister publication called Sri Dharma. This magazine publicised the social and political issues that women face in India, the association's campaign to resolve these issues, and the feminist movements occurring worldwide. Cousins was instrumental in helping Indian feminism move into a new phase in the 1920s and 1930s, as more and more women rose up to demand their rights. But Margaret Cousins' contribution to Indian feminism is missing from a lot of the Irish papers. One reason may be because of the underlying sexism of the Irish press. The most coverage she attracted was when she was sentenced to a year's imprisonment in December 1932 for her involvement in Gandhi's civil disobedience campaign. Even in this, however, Cousins is constantly tied to her husband. It doesn't matter if these papers are nationalist or unionist in their political leaning. On the nationalist side, newspapers like the Irish Independent and the Irish Press refer to her as the Irish poet's wife in its headlines about her agitation in India. The unionist press also make much of the connection with her husband. One particularly bizarre article in the Northern Whig ran with the headline, "Belfast Man in India, Poet's Wife on Sedition Charge." This would suggest that her political action in India was only legitimised through her relationship with her husband, and he remained the most important aspect of her life. Each article details James Cousins' literary contribution as a poet and dramatist, while very few detail Margaret Cousins' suffragette activities in Ireland. The only exception is the nationalist paper The Kerry Champion, which cites Margaret Cousins' previous suffragette activities, her work with Annie Besant in Indian nationalism, and her literary works. Only in the last line does the writer mention that her husband is Dr. J.H. Cousins. This is more reflective of her life story, given that she should have been well known back in Ireland in her own right. She'd been one of the founders of the Irish Women's Franchise League, alongside Hannah Skeffington, yet her husband's literary career is given greater significance in the rest of the Irish press. This was typical of an Irish marriage in the 1930s. A middle-class Irish woman like Margaret Cousins was not expected to work or engage in political activity. She was expected to stay home, look after the domestic duties and the children. The fact that James Cousins allowed his wife so much freedom to pursue her political interests was certainly unusual for the time. Thus, this may explain why some of Margaret Cousins' accomplishments have been overlooked by the Irish press. They did not see her as an individual with distinct interests, but as a supportive presence to her husband and his literary accomplishments. Another reason why Cousins has been neglected in the Irish press is because she took a backseat role in the Indian feminist movement. The historian Catherine Candy really stresses this. She notes how Cousins seemed to train Indian women for leadership positions and wanted to ensure that they were taking an active role in the fight for their rights. We can trace this throughout Cousins' activism in Indian feminism, when she organised a deputation of Indian women to petition the British for female suffrage in 1919. Sarojini Naidu read out the deputation to the British authorities. Cousins did not take the lead in this. She wanted the campaign for female suffrage to come from the Indian women themselves, not from an outsider. As Cousins herself wrote, "Curiously enough, though I had the backing of some of the best women of India, I was the one voice publicly explaining and proclaiming the suffrage cause, not because I had any special fitness, but simply because the womanhood of India had not yet found its authoritative voice." So Margaret Cousins' main goal was to cultivate this authoritative voice in Indian women, so that they could lead themselves. In order to do this, she tried to propel Indian women into the political arena. In 1926, when women were first allowed to run for seats in the provincial councils, Cousins helped organise the election campaign of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. She would ultimately lose, but Chattopadhyay would go on to become a leading figure in the Indian independence movement. The organisations she helped to found, the Women's Indian Association in 1917 and the All India Women's Conference in 1926, also gave Indian women this voice. It was their chance to openly discuss the injustices that they faced, and to fight against these deprivations by campaigning to implement legislation. For example, the lobbying of the All India Women's Conference was essential in getting the SADA Act passed in 1929. This bill pushed the age of marriage back to 14 for girls and 18 for boys. Therefore, it was Margaret Cousins who helped Indian feminism move into this new phase, through her participation in feminist organisations and campaigns for female suffrage. She put Indian feminists at the head of the struggle for women's rights, and the late 1920s and 1930s brought new discussions amongst Indian feminists about the way they wanted their feminist movement to progress. Ironically, one of the catalysts for this was a book written by the American conservative Catherine Mayo called Mother India. By the time Mother India was published in 1927, Catherine Mayo had become well known in America. In her early writings, she promoted American nativism, calling for greater immigration restrictions and supporting the interests of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in America. Thus, Mayo strongly opposed Catholic and non-white immigration. Catherine Mayo was also a strong imperialist, believing that both Britain and America had a responsibility for their colonial peoples, and that this was justified because of the supposed uncivilized and backward nature of the colonized people. Along the same lines, Mayo published Mother India, a propaganda piece which intended to challenge the Indian nationalist movement. It attacked many Hindu practices, including child marriage and motherhood, the abuse suffered by widows, and the caste system. Mayo used these customs as evidence that Indian people were inherently uncivilized and incapable of self-governance. Many Irish papers sided with Mayo in arguing that India was not ready for self-government because of the treatment of its women. For example, an article appearing in the Northern Irish paper, the Northern Whig, maintains that in relation to India, those who are seeking to place it politically on the same standing as Britain conveniently forget the cruelties of the caste system, the child marriages and widowhood, and the terrible position of the untouchable classes. In this, the Northern Whig emphatically denies that India is equal to Britain, and it will never be on the same standing because it will never be civilised enough to self-govern. The writer also takes Catherine Mayo's word as fact and extensively quotes from Mother India, including this quote: "An outsider sitting today through sessions of Indian legislatures, central or provincial, somehow comes to feel like one observing a roomful of small and mischievous children who by accident have got hold of a magnificent watch. They fight and scramble to thrust their fingers into it, to pull off a wheel or two, to play with the mainspring, to pick out the jewels. And when the teacher tries to explain to them how to wind their toy up, they shriek and grimace in fretful impatience and stuff their butterscotch into the works." Mayo sees Britain as this teacher, this authority which is preventing Indians from wrecking their own country. As far as the Northern Whig sees it too, India will never be capable of self-governance. What is interesting here is that the ideas used by the British to justify their rule in India were the same used to describe the Irish and to justify British rule there. The Irish press's reaction to Mother India is also significant in how many of them discount the women's movement in India. The Longford leader stresses that Indian women are unable to help themselves out of their predicament. As the writer puts it, they resist all attempts to rescue them from purdah, prison-like seclusion, and from sati, burning widows alive. As often as any were led out of their wretched state, they seem determined to rush back to it, as horses run back into a burning stable. In this, they support much of what Mayo believed about the state of the women's movement in India. She took the word of the British authorities that Indian women were only minimally engaged in politics, and her book was based on the idea that Indian women were helpless victims. As can be expected, most Indian feminists were outraged by Mayo's criticism of the condition of Indian women, especially given her position as a Western woman. As the historian Mrinalini Sinha describes, the few Indian women that Catherine Mayo spoke to for research distanced themselves from her on the book's release. The only exception was Cornelia Sorabji, a committed social reformer and loyalist to British rule. She agreed with some of Mayo's comments on India's social problems, but she did not like how Mayo had linked these social ills with the nationalist movement. For not publicly criticising Mother India, Sorabji was ostracised by many Indian feminists and was condemned by the nationalist press. In the late 1920s, the Indian feminist movement took a more nationalist turn, as many nationalists and feminists saw independence for India and women's rights as twin goals. According to the historian Partha Chatterjee, liberal Indian nationalists had been faced with a dilemma from the late 19th century. They wanted to preserve an essential Indianness to their nationalist movement, but they also wanted women to gain more rights and freedoms. Thus, as Chatterjee argues, Indian nationalists split Indian culture between the spiritual and material world. Within this framing, women were the custodians of pure Indian culture, while men could advance in the material world. This often meant that discussions over women's rights were essentially the competition between two patriarchies over who could control women's bodies and lives. For many Indian women, it was only when they were free from colonial control that Indians could make their own decisions about women's rights. And so many Indian feminists sought to reconcile the aims of both nationalism and feminism. Sarojini Naidu was such a figure. She had always been a prominent spokesperson for both feminism and nationalism, seeking to reconcile the two movements. We can see this in an article by the Northern Irish paper, the Belfast Telegraph. In its interview with Sarojini Naidu, she claims that women have a better position in India than they do in the West. When asked what she thought of the British feminist movement, she responded, "Frankly, I would be ashamed to belong to such a movement. It is a confession of women's inferiority. We have never had such a feminist movement in India. There has never been need for anything of the kind. In India, the question of sex does not arise, but the question of who is most fitted for the job." The Belfast Telegraph does not support her comments and prints the article under the headline, "India is Women's Utopia," with a question mark at the end. The writer for the Belfast Telegraph clearly does not take kindly to being lectured on British feminism by an Indian woman, especially a nationalist. Of course, it is obvious that Naidu is trying to prove that India is a civilised country, to counter Catherine Mayo's claims, and to show that it is capable of governing itself. In this, Naidu is supporting the nationalist cause more than the feminist cause, even though she had been part of both causes for many years. For many, this was a sellout of Indian feminism, but the Belfast Telegraph's position was complicated too. They did not necessarily want Indian women to have fewer rights, but were also still heavily invested in the idea of the British Empire and its supposed defence of the vulnerable. Certainly, they did not like Sarojini Naidu suggesting that Indian womanhood were in a superior position to British women. In contrast, the nationalist paper The Irish Examiner praised many Indian feminists' move towards nationalism. In an article published in 1930, the writer argues that the part of Indian womanhood in the present movement will go down as one of the noblest chapters in the history of the struggle. Further, its writer declares that the women of Hindustan, long hidden in purdah and crushed down by child marriage, is coming into her own in this new India which is evolving out of the present struggle. In this, the Irish Examiner was firmly on the side of the nationalist. The paper believed that an independent India would give more rights to its women than the British had given them. Certainly, Irish nationalists could see that the same had happened in Ireland with voting rights. When the Irish Free State was established in 1922, all men and women over the age of 21 were given the right to vote, while most women in Britain had to wait until 1928 before they could vote. Although some of the more liberal freedoms given to Irish women were rescinded in the 1930s with the conservative laws passed by Eamon de Valera's government. This is part of a wider story whereby Irish nationalists claimed to support or to influence nationalist movements elsewhere, and where Irish nationalists were keen to promote the benefits of independence for ordinary citizens. The historian Kate O'Malley has written about how the Irish delegates of the League Against Imperialism spoke of their independence. Indian nationalists found that they could learn from the experience of the Irish delegates. They listened closely as these delegates described the way that they had wrestled from British rule, because these Indian nationalists could see in an independent Ireland a future for India. This was just one small part of the larger story of Irish and Indian nationalist connections, but it shows that Irish nationalists were appreciative that India was following so closely in its footsteps. For them, the turn of Indian feminists towards nationalism was a step along the way in India securing independence. Therefore, the nationalist turn in Indian feminism caused a profound difference in how the unionist and nationalist press reacted to Indian feminism. Further, in response to Catherine Mayo's Mother India, some Indian feminists more strongly expressed the need for Indian feminism to be led only by Indian women. For example, Dhanvanthi Ramarao believed that Western women had no place in Indian feminism. She did not want British or American feminists to help in the uplift of Indian women. Margaret Cousins' place in all this is very interesting. She continued to support Indian feminism into the 1930s, and did not encounter as much criticism as the British and American feminists who concerned themselves with Indian womanhood. According to the historian Barbara Ramusak, This was due to her Irish background and the prolonged time that she had spent in India. Ramosak argues that by being Irish, Cousins had less cultural baggage than a British or American feminist would have. She had not been brought up in an imperial culture which saw Indian women as less than and in need of teaching or civilizing by their colonizers. Actually, Cousins had lived as one of these women in the empire who were judged as inherently backward, as there were similar stereotypes about Irish society as there were about Indian society. The influence of Catholicism was seen as just as problematic as the influence of Hinduism and Islam in India. As well, the parallels between the nationalist causes cannot be ignored. Like Ireland, India also was attempting to wrestle from the yoke of the British Empire, and Indian nationalists saw commonality in the work of the Irish Home Rulers and Sinn Féin. Thus, it was assumed that given Cousins' Irish background, she was anti-British and anti-imperialist. Cousins did prove this by taking part in Gandhi's nationalist civil disobedience campaign, and by being imprisoned for a year for her nationalist action. This is why Margaret Cousins was made president of the All India Women's Conference in 1936, when there were opposing factions, because as Ramosak argues, she presents a neutral figure to Indian feminists. Her Irish background made her sympathetic to their nationalist and feminist cause, but also wary of the imperial culture that had been imposed on Ireland as it was on India. Unlike the British and American feminists of the time, she did not want to teach or civilize Indian women. She simply wanted to help their cause. Cousins decided to retire from her feminist activities in 1943, arguing, "I had the feeling that direct participation by me was no longer required or even desired by the leaders of Indian womanhood, who were now coming to the front. Truly, this was what made her a feminist ally to the women of India." Margaret Cousins helped give Indian women a political voice and then reduced her public role as Indian feminism came into its own in the 1920s and 30s. If we think about the role of Margaret Cousins, as well as Sister Nivedita and Annie Besant, which were heard about in the previous episode, all three of these women tell us something about the difficulty of standing up for women's rights in India while remaining an outsider. There was a thin line these women had to tread between being a feminist ally to the women of India and being a maternal imperialist. Some Hindu and Muslim practices of the early 20th century were certainly detrimental to women's rights, and so it is understandable why so many Western women who journeyed to India condemned these practices and sought social reform. At the same time, the colonizers often exaggerated these customs and made them symbolic of all Indian culture to justify colonial rule, while ignoring the poor treatment and legal status of women in Britain. But it was also a complicated issue for the nationalist movement in India too, and there remained little consensus on whether women should gain increased rights in the public and private spheres, or whether Indian women embodied the essential moral and spiritual Indianness of their nation. In this view, to liberate these women from practices like child marriage and seclusion was to westernize them and risk losing their sense of national identity. Reconciling these two aspects was even harder for Indian women who were both nationalist and feminist. In much the same way, the British viewed middle-class women as morally superior, virtuous and pure, through their femininity and domesticity as angels in the house and producers of the next generation. They kept men and wider society in check. The increasing expansion of women's rights in Britain was supported by some reformers but also feared by many. This can be evidenced in the Irish press, where the Unionist papers broadly suggested that British imperialism held the answer to women's oppression, while the nationalist press thought that women's rights could only be guaranteed and strengthened in an independent nation. The Irish press was much more interested in the nationalist aspects of these three women than in their promotion of women's rights. They do pay more attention after Indian feminism took a more nationalist turn in the late 1920s and 1930s, but this was likely due to the growing global interest in the nationalist movement led by Gandhi. While British and American feminists such as Catherine Mayo or Eleanor Rathbone campaigned for Indian women's issues, the historian Mrinalini Sinha argues that this was the moment when Indian women began to articulate their own concerns on the world stage. This meant that it became increasingly difficult even for an Irish woman like Margaret Cousins to involve herself in Indian feminism. We can understand where these Indian women were coming from. Interference by white Western women in a foreign feminist movement is indeed problematic, particularly when these women are linked to an imperial power, and this problem persists. It could, for example, be argued that the US and NATO engaged in the Afghanistan conflict as part of a kind of civilizing mission, justifying their presence as trying to spread Western liberal values like democracy and women's rights. At the same time, the Taliban and other religious groups argue that these rights are Western and that Sharia or local law offers better opportunities for women to live successful and fulfilling lives. While Afghan feminists might appreciate support from their Western sisters, they need to articulate their own ideas of justice, rights, and equality in ways that make sense within their own context. As we see with the examples of Sister Nivedita, Annie Besant, and Margaret Cousins, the difference between enforcing our Western ideas and improving the rights of groups and individuals is complicated. In much the same way that British and American feminists of the early 20th century believed that they were saving Indian women, the Western world wants to save Afghan women from their men. Hopefully, by thinking about these free Irish women, considering the impact they had in Ireland and in India, we can question our own practices and biases as we think about women's rights across the globe in the 21st century.